Hello everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to be taking a look at H.P. Lovecraft, his philosophy as an artist and an author, and I'll provide you some background information on the Call of Cthulhu as a story and what Lovecraft intended to do with this work. The Call of Cthulhu itself is the first of H.P. Lovecraft's great works. H.P. Lovecraft's career can be divided up into three distinct sections. In the first, during his young career as an author, he was fixated on the reproduction of the moods and styles evoked by Poe. Edgar Allan Poe was his greatest literary inspiration as a youth. So many of these stories in what is known as his Poe phase, his macabre phase, or his Gothic phase are fairly stereotypical or standard horror narratives in the vein of the psychological realism of Edgar Allan Poe. After that point, he encountered Baron Dunsany. Now, Dunsany was an author primarily of fantasy tales in a style somewhat akin to Through the Dragon Glass or the universe on the other side of the Dragon Glass, but far more epic in scale. And he took much of his inspiration from the King James Bible in terms of his prose style and the evocative imagery that he presents, the fantastical universes that he creates. During this sort of Dunsanian phase, H.P. Lovecraft was focused on the creation of a kind of sense of wonder in a fantasy world that he titled, that he called, the Land of Minar, and the Dreamlands, which could be accessed through the dreams and visions of characters from our own world. So it's very much in that fantasy weird tale cast. Then we come to the essay that we read at the beginning of this course. He produced supernatural horror and literature as a kind of catalog of the various different kinds of weird tales, the effects created by weird tales, and of the different authors and the ways in which they have employed certain techniques to create the feelings of the weird. It seemed as if it was necessary for him to take stock of that which had come prior to his work in order to better understand the genre in which he was writing, or in the sense, the genre that he was inventing, and the way in which he was going to contribute to it in a unique, original fashion, moving beyond his literary antecedents and ancestors like Poe and Dunsany. By understanding what they did, he could further refine his own techniques. And what we have in the Call of Cthulhu is a watershed moment in the genre of horror or in the genre of the weird, because finally Lovecraft discovered his own voice, his own style, what Yashi describes in his article as quasi-science fiction, or the quasi-science fiction weird tale. Now, as you saw in that documentary on H.P. Lovecraft, one of the things that defines his works is the creation of a grand mythos. Now, the mythos is not actually something that Lovecraft probably intended to create, but it may account for Lovecraft's enduring popularity and the explosion of that popularity, particularly in recent decades. The Cthulhu mythos is a kind of interconnectivity within Lovecraft stories. After the Call of Cthulhu, and even somewhat beyond before that, as he drew from threads and tendrils that existed in those prior stories, Lovecraft created a kind of complex webwork of associations and references inside of his works. He created a kind of mythological history that stretched back billions of years before the evolution of humanity, before the creation of Earth itself. And it is this vast cosmic scope and the connections between different books and prophets, gods and divinities, powers, forces beyond mankind's understanding that have spread out across his literature and then almost infected other authors who were inspired by him. So other authors would come and take his works or take his ideas and the creatures and books that he mentions and use them in their own stories. It's these things that have helped to contribute to Lovecraft's enduring popularity. And it's the thing that inspired me and that enraptured me. I was fascinated by this grandiose universe, this yawning black abyss of horror that opened up before my eyes when I was a teenager and I first encountered Lovecraft. There was so much to see and so much to learn. And I was fascinated by that world. So some of these common things that we see across Lovecraft stories as he references them again and again and again, they appear in multiple stories, and other authors come along, read Lovecraft stories, and say, I like the title of this book, or I like this particular character that existed in the history of Lovecraft's universe, or I like the names of these various gods within Lovecraft's fictional pantheon. I'm going to take those and use them for myself. There's an interconnected underlying myth that is established inside Lovecraft's universe after the Call of Cthulhu, moving on through his great works like The Shadow of Time, The Shadow over Innsmouth, and these other stories, The Color Out of Space, that carries into and is appropriated by his proteges, his imitators, and other authors as they go on down through the years. Some of these figures that stand out in the Cthulhu mythos, even if they're only mentioned briefly or once by Lovecraft. Things like Cthulhu himself, this great creature lying under the ocean that affects men through their dreams. Artist depictions here of the agglomeration of protoplasmic bubbles that seethes outside of time and space, the key in the gate, Yog-Sothoth, this bizarre creature that almost seems like it is the universe itself. Shoggoths, servitors for the elder things that live in the Antarctic and where it went extinct billions of years ago. Nyarlathotep, the servitor of the elder gods, who takes a kind of physical form as a man inside our universe or inside our world and seems to delight in tormenting humanity. While all the other creatures in Lovecraft's pantheon appear malign but indifferent to humanity, Nyarlathotep seems to, or Nyarlathotep seems to enjoy inflicting pain. A being or entity that is beyond Lovecraft, that was sort of folded into Lovecraft's grand mythos, the King in Yellow, described by Robert Chambers. If you've ever seen the first season of True Detective, which I would highly recommend, what you have is essentially a continuation of H.P. Lovecraft's mythos, an appropriation of it. The King in Yellow, described therein, the city of Carcosa and all that, it all plays into this grand mythos, not something that was created by Lovecraft, in this case, the King in Yellow created by another author, but a fantastical, magical, otherworldly god that has been folded into that mythos and is now part of the same sort of mytho-historical cycle. Now, Lovecraft himself also dropped all kinds of names of books and historical figures. One of the principal ones would be the Necronomicon, which is referenced in the Call of Cthulhu several times. The Necronomicon, written by Abdul al-Hazred, and his sort of prophetic warnings of doom about the coming of the old ones and this access that he has and that he has recorded to other worlds and to visions of the future. Also, key locations. So Lovecraft came up with a variety of different fictional locations in New England, including the city of Arkham, where Batman's Arkham Asylum takes its name. So if you've ever read any Batman comics or you've played the Arkham Asylum series of video games, those come from H.P. Lovecraft's fictional city of Arkham and the Arkham Sanatorium, the madhouse that lies inside the city. All these places, all these gods, all these books are part of an interconnected series of, or kind of interconnected world that Lovecraft created. It wasn't something that he consciously developed, but he began to sort of piece together these little references and nods, allusions. He kept using the same places and the same names over and over again, and that was picked up and grown into this massive edifice that is the Cthulhu mythos. Now, H.P. Lovecraft himself, as an author, H.P. Lovecraft said that in the end, what he was trying to do in all of his stories, whether it was a work of horror, a fantasy, or one of those Poe style Gothic narratives, was to create or to recreate, reproduce a mood. Lovecraft had a particular emotional sensation or affect that he wanted to create, that he felt himself, and that he wanted to share and reproduce in his readers and in his fiction. For Lovecraft, although he plotted his tales meticulously, reflecting on specifics of time and distance very, very carefully, was more focused on the marvel at the heart of a tale. So he was focused on the kind of revelation, recognition, or realization that, as he says, by its mere existence should overshadow the characters and events. The plot of the story, as carefully as he does work it out, and the characters, who are mere pawns to be moved about the chessboard, they are secondary and indeed tertiary concerns. The thing that Lovecraft is interested in is that spectacular moment of revelation that oftentimes seems obvious to us, but the characters inside the story are so fixated on denying or suppressing. There's some revelation of a grand universe destroying horror or realization that they're suppressing because their feeble minds cannot contend with it. They cannot come to terms with it. They can't accept it. Lovecraft himself, as he said, wrote because of a wish to get on paper some of the images constantly running through his mind. So he's beset, as a child, by dreams and nightmares, night terrors. As an adult, he suffers from the same kinds of neuroses that governed him as a youth. And he's beset by images and phantasmagorical scenes that he has to get out of his own mind and put to paper in order to reconcile himself to them. Now, why does he do this? Why does he have to put these images onto paper? Well, it's not because necessarily he wants to horrify people. It's because, as he says, a highly organized man can't exist endurably without mental expansions beyond objective reality. Lovecraft was a man who felt trapped by this world. He was a man out of time, a kind of New England gentleman who was not a New England gentleman anymore because he didn't have the funds to kind of finance that life. Lovecraft was not a man made for this world, for this time, a time of burgeoning racial heterogeneity and a kind of cultural openness that is only starting at this point in time. He is not fit for this century, and he's not fit for the concerns of a working life. Everything about love, finance, day-to-day affairs, these are unendurable, intolerable to him. They're dull, prosaic, boring. He had to escape from them in some way. And those dreams and those visions that he could then put to paper and re-experience were his means of escaping from this, well, dull life. He held, as he said, a burning curiosity concerning the vast spheres of unplumbed and unplumbable cosmic spaces, which press down tantalizingly on all sides of our pitifully tiny sphere of the known. So those gestures out into the unknown spheres beyond our realm of the safety and the known, that expansion beyond the known is actually tantalizing, it's wondrous. And yet, the result of it, as we saw in Through the Dragon Glass, is always the corruption, the tainting of that beauty into something that is horrifying and disturbing. And so, as Lovecraft puts these dreams and visions and fantasies to paper, as he tries to recreate the moods that have existed inside of his own mind, inside of his own heart, he grapples with the reality that any attempt to do so, the exploration of those unplumbed and unplumbable cosmic spheres, those cosmic spheres that are beyond our ability to see and that will forever be beyond our ability to grapple with and understand and plumb and explore. That process actually leads to something disturbing and horrifying as we are confronted with our position in the universe and our insignificance, the limitations of our knowledge and the limitations of our being. And it is that, with respect to cosmicism and Lovecraft's predominant literary philosophy and theme, that we discussed in our synchronous lecture earlier today, or earlier on July 13th, 2020, whenever you're watching this video. So if you want an expansion of how Lovecraft approaches this reality through his mythos, through his fantastical gods and demons, you can watch through that synchronous lecture posted in the Distributed Documents tab on Omnibox.